Hello, everyone, and welcome to online lecture 2. Today we will be discussing research ethics. Again, I feel like this is another topic where you may have a fair amount of familiarity already, but we are going to make sure that the ethics you learned about also apply to research and that we fill in any gaps that might be there. Okay. So for the reading for this section, please go ahead and read the APA Ethics Code Standard 8. So if you just go to this link and then go to number 8 down, you will find that. I have an optional article for you guys in case you find it interesting on gender and authorship. I think you might enjoy it. And then go on to chapter 4, which is about sampling. And that's what we'll be talking about going forward. Okay? All right. So what are ethics? Well, let's start with some different perspectives. So, for example, the utilitarian perspective says that your decision should do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The altruistic perspective says helping others without personal benefit. That should be your goal. And egoism is that individuals should act in accordance with their own self-interests. Say hello, everyone, to Bert Phelps. He'll be taking the job of security manager for our entire poultry products division. Okay. Why is ethics important to research? Well, first, it promotes a variety of moral and societal values. We want to advance the key aims of research itself, and it ensures that researchers and funders are held accountable to the public. And that last one is pretty important because anytime you have money getting in the way of ethics and research, you have to really be kind of wary about how that will play out. Okay. So researchers, of course, have a duty to value human rights, legal compliance, and safety. And of course, we want our researchers to be free from conflicts of interest. Okay, so let's look at a definition for research ethics. A set of guidelines to assist the researcher in conducting ethical research. And we might consider the relationship between science and society. So there is a fair amount of government funding of scientific research. And even though that mostly takes on a scholarly approach, there is some congressional influence on which studies are funded. And I'll give you an example of AIDS research, which decades upon decades ago, good luck trying to fund it. When there was a lot of bias towards the disease, there was a lot of ignorance about the disease, and it was very hard to get funding for the disease. And then there was another period some time ago where AIDS was very well funded. I mean, write any project about AIDS and you're likely to get funded. So it went from one extreme to another, and so political ideals and influence has an impact on what kind of research gets out there, at least the kind of grant research that gets out there. Okay. Corporate funding of scientific research. I mean, you might, when you hear this, you probably think of pharmacology companies, right? Pharmaceutical companies. And whenever we're talking about drug research, there is potentially a conflict of interest with researchers' activities, and that can lead to a public distrust of science. So we have to be that much more careful when we are doing that kind of drug research to not only publish the positives, but to, be fair and publish the negatives as well. And there is a great video on this that I might share with you if you're interested, that discusses how much of pharmaceutical research sometimes does not come to light, that there's a bit of a bias towards the more positive findings. So kind of interesting. Okay. Okay, professional issues. So let's talk about research misconduct, which involves the fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or in reporting research results. Okay, and that came out from the OSTP, or the Office of Science and Technology Policy, way back in 2005. So to fabricate is to simply make up results. To falsify is to change items around your methodology or around your results. And of course, plagiarism is to copy another one's work. Treatment of research participants. The most fundamental issue confronted by scientists is treatment of research participants, because your participants may be at risk for physical and psychological harm, and scientists are obligated to consider the ethics of conducting the necessary research. And I've seen both sides of this. I've seen where sometimes the scientists might be pushing too far in terms of the risk for harm. And I've seen sometimes where the ethical board, like the IRB, might say, oh, you can't ask a question about suicidality because it might cause people to commit suicide. Whereas the research has actually shown this to be a false statement. So it can go both ways. Okay. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit background. I suspect you know most of these studies, but let's just quickly go over them. So one of the first, big topics we talk about sometimes is the World War II Nazi inhumane research done without permission, done. Sometimes these were quite harmful studies. Sometimes these were quite painful studies, and they were just done on people who were in concentration camps or otherwise controlled by the Nazis. So that was one. Let's talk about the Milgram's obedience experiment, one you probably know about. So we have a person in a lab coat who is leading the study, and we have a Confederate who's in on the study, and we have one teacher and one learner. So two people come into the room, the Confederate and someone else. They draw slips, but this is rigged so that the Confederate's always the learner and the participant's always the teacher. The learner's hooked to a shock machine, which goes from 15 to 450. And there's different labels that says slight, moderate, danger, severe shock, and a red XXX above 400. And the question was, of course, how far would people go? How far would the teachers go in administering the shocks when being told to by the person in the lab coat? And 65% went to 450. So we got some very important and interesting results about obedience, but of course we must question the ethics of this particular study. I mean, the teachers were really put in a bit of a quandary there. Okay, so little Albert, you probably know this one as well. It's basically how they induced fear in this little child of, it was supposed to be of white rats, by banging something very loud every time the child encountered a white rat. Before they had no fear of it, then they had fear of it. And not only this, but it generalized to white bunnies, to even a Santa Claus beard. So again, interesting research, but at the expense of ethics in some ways. Thalidomide, try that again. Thalidomide tragedy. This was a drug given to expectant mothers that had very poor effects on the outcomes of the children they give birth to, as well as to the mothers, if memory serves. And basically, the issue here is that they should have been aware of these effects and should never have really administered this drug. So it's that was kind of something that came out later on. So that was very unfortunate as well. Okay, the Tuskegee syphilis study that went on from 1932 to 1972, which is absolutely tragic. The U.S. Public Health Service conducted research on the effects of untreated syphilis on Black men in Macon County, Alabama. The PHS was deceptive in its recruitment by offering them free physical exams and treatments for other ailments. But they were not clear that they were not being treated for syphilis. And they also told local physicians to not give them treatment for syphilis. Participants who were offered treatment for syphilis were told they would be dropped from the study and its benefits. Okay, so really a lot of coercion there to participate. Okay. Let's talk about Henrietta Lacks. There's a great book on this, by the way, and a nice, kind of like book club type book read if you're interested in learning more about this one. But basically in 1951, a poor African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks dies of cervical cancer. But pieces of the tumor that killed her, taken without her knowledge or consent, live on, first in one lab, then in hundreds, then thousands, then in giant factories churning out polio vaccines, then aboard rocket ships launched into space. The cells from this one tumor would spawn a multi-billion-dollar industry and become a foundation of modern science, leading to breakthroughs in gene mapping, cloning, and fertility, and helping to discover how viruses work and how cancer develops, among a million other things. Now, Henrietta's cells have been bought and sold by the billions, but she remains virtually unknown, and her family can't afford health insurance to care for diseases their mother's cells have helped to cure. There has been some movement on this one, actually. It's kind of interesting. I haven't completely kept up to date on it, but it's a very interesting piece. Okay, and then just in case you haven't heard about it, that MMR vaccine and autism. Okay, so we've all heard about this notion, right, that there might be this association between MMR vaccine and autism. Well, here's why people believe this. One person did a study, and it came out in Lancet. Lancet's a very well-known, very well-respected journal. And unfortunately, the researcher was not ethical in his process. He got blood at a birthday party. He had financial incentives to discredit the MMR vaccine. He used poor methods. He used poor reporting. There have been many, many better studies that have been done since then showing this lack of a relationship. Yet because that got out there first and the media caught it, people still believe that there is this potential link. And it's tough because, the vaccine that you give for MMR happens to occur around the same time that you might see a child develop these features of autism. So of course people think there might be an association, but the research doesn't bear that out. Okay. So let's talk about the history of some ethical guidelines, and you'll probably see that there is a bit of a reactionary tendency to these ethical guidelines. Okay, so in other words, the Nuremberg Code, which happened in 1946, was a result of World War II Nazi inhumane research. And then we see in 1953 the first APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. And then in 1979, we see the Belmont Report with ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects of research. Okay. Oh, and here is a kind of a picture to give you an idea about Milgram's obedience studies. I think this is a little bit, yeah, it's from a film. I don't think they were quite really that close, the teacher and the learner. So I think this is a little bit of a dramatized picture. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Belmont Report. So there are three main principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. When we're talking about respect for persons, we have to be aware of vulnerable populations like children, like prisoners. We have to look for assent. We have to look for agreement to actually participate in the study, and as well as informed consent. All right, they have to be informed about all the benefits, all the possible disadvantages of participating in the study, and of course you have to have voluntary participation. Beneficence: we want no greater than minimal risk for our participants. We want no greater than minimal risk for our participants. And justice: when we talk, sorry, something went wrong with my slide set. Give me 1 second to catch you back up. Sorry about that. When we talk about, so we were talking about respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. When we talk about justice, we think about things like to each person an equal share, to each person according to their individual need, to each person according to their individual effort, to each person according to societal contribution, and to each person according to merit. So just different notions that come to mind when we're thinking about justice here. Okay. So Belmont Principle 1, beneficence and non-malfeasance, we often want to think about conducting a cost-benefit analysis, right? What is the cost of doing the study versus the benefit? Does the benefit outweigh the cost? We talked a little bit about beneficence. Do no harm, maximize possible benefits, minimize possible harm. Non-malfeasance, we don't want to do any harm. Confidentiality, anonymity. Let's just briefly talk about, sorry, for non-malfeasance, we're talking about confidentiality and anonymity. And let's just talk about the difference between those two real quick. Confidentiality is usually the minimum you want to do, which is you're going to offer to participants that you will keep their records, their data, all that private. Anonymity is sometimes you can offer this in a study. I have tried to find new ways to actually offer participants anonymity in studies. It can be tough, but basic anonymity, you're keeping them anonymous. You don't know who gave you which result. Okay. And for types of harm, we could talk about physical harm, psychological harm. And then we also must consider the cost of not doing the research, right? And there often is a cost of not doing certain research, right? Not learning about a potentially very helpful treatment or very helpful preventive approach to suicidality, for example. Okay. Justice. We talked about the Tuskegee study. There was a stutter study too. We can talk about that more in class if you'd like to. If you're not familiar with that study, I'm not remembering it off the top of my head, but I will get you more information about that study if you're interested in it. Okay. So let's talk about a potential ethical dilemma. As a therapist, you've developed a potential treatment for severe depression and suicidal ideation. To test it, you randomly assign patients to the treatment or no treatment condition. After you've run your test with a few participants, it is clear your treatment is highly effective. How do you proceed? Are you going to give the treatment to everyone? Are you going to continue to study? Are you going to do some sort of wait list? Can you afford to do a wait list? Okay. Belmont Principle 3, respect for persons. Autonomy, right? That goes along with informed consent. Everyone has to be informed about what they're agreeing to for a given study. General purpose, voluntary participation. What are the risks? What are the benefits? You have freedom to withdraw at any time without risk to your benefits. In other words, you don't give up your benefits if you withdraw. And we try and make our informed consent as jargon-free as possible. Assent. Yeah. So one area where we talk about assent versus informed consent is with kids, right? With children, and they can't actually give an informed consent, but they can still agree to participate in the study. So we generally get informed consent from the guardian or guardians, and then assent from the kids as well, or children. Privacy, again, we have anonymity versus confidentiality, which we just talked about. And there is, you can try to de-identify your participants as well. There was an interesting study that came out a little while ago about, basically it was a medical issue. And someone took just the basic demographic characteristics of an individual and was able to figure out who that individual was. So they weren't given the name or anything. They were just given some basic demographics and were able to trace that back to the individual. So when we talk about de-identifying records or de-identifying cases, we might not only need to remove names, but we might need to remove certain demographic characteristics or other characteristics as well. Okay. Deception and debriefing. So as I'm sure you're aware, deception can occur in most studies, or in many studies. Basically what you're doing is you're not telling them the full story about what you are assessing. So I'll give you an example. I did a study a little while back that wanted to look at how you establish anonymity across a longitudinal study, right? So across a study that has more than one time point. And the problem is you need to be able to attach person one's data from time one to person one's data for time two, but you want to keep them anonymous. So how are you going to do this? So one way people often do this is with a self-generated identification code. So you have to figure out certain questions that you can ask the participant that will yield unique but non-identifiable responses. So for example, what's the second letter of your first name? And if you put enough of these different characteristics together, you can yield a unique code. You want it to be stable across time, right? You need it, so you don't want to ask them what's your favorite, what's the third letter of your favorite football team in case their favorite football team changes. Although I guess some would argue that's a very stable characteristic that should never change. But you get my point. So I had a study set up like this, right? So I had one group who I told, by the way, as you're developing this self-generated identification code, and this is going to keep you anonymous, please bear in mind that later on you're going to be asked some very personal information. And I went into more details about this. And then I asked them, how did they feel about their code? Okay, so they never were asked for any personal information. That was a deception. I told them that because I wanted to see how they felt about the code, even in a situation where that could be the case. Okay, and then of course, afterwards, we debriefed, we discussed the deception, and we discussed why it was there. Okay. Right to service and use of placebos. So that's an interesting piece there too. You know, what do we do when we're trying to compare a treatment or a new treatment to something to a placebo, to not giving anything? And you probably have noticed that a lot of studies have changed from offering placebos to offering standard of care. Now, I'll give you an example where that wasn't the case recently. I had a friend who participated in one of the clinical trials for the COVID vaccine for Pfizer. She was part of the Pfizer one. And basically, she was either given the actual vaccine or a placebo as part of the clinical trial. And the deal they made with her, or as part of her study, as soon as she was offered any opportunity to receive the vaccine, they would unblind her so she could know whether she got the actual vaccine or a placebo. Okay. So it kind of gets interesting. Okay. All right. We finally computerized your files. Now we just have to get them off of Facebook. It's kind of scary. All right. Ethical issues when conducting research. So as you know, there's the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Codes of Conduct. There are 10 standards of conduct, with standard 8 being focused on research and publication. So that's the standard I'm asking you to just make sure you review and have a good understanding of. Okay. So with the APA Ethics Code as well, there's 5 general principles, and this will probably sound familiar from the Belmont Code, right? Beneficence, maximize benefits and minimize harm. Responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for the rights and dignity of others. Okay, so other things I want to bring up is IRB approval. Institutional approval equals IRB approval, right? And I assume maybe one of you didn't need the IRB, but probably most of you did need the IRB approval or seeking that to get your study approved. And any institution that gets any kind of federal funding is bound to have an IRB. Okay. That's just necessary. And the IRB is composed mostly of people from the university, but it's always supposed to have one outside member. Okay. And that's basically to keep things unbiased, keep things honest, right? But what's interesting is that even though it'll be composed of members of your university, primarily, it doesn't have to be composed of anyone from your field of research. So you really have to walk people step by step through an understanding of your literature, and an understanding of what you want to do in a way that works for a chemist as well as for a psychologist. Okay. Informed consent. Again, we've talked about fully informing participants of all aspects of the study with minors, consent, right, and assent. We talked about the difference there. And let's talk a little bit about passive consent versus active consent. So let's say you were doing an internet type study, which is probably pretty common right now. Sometimes it's hard to get the participants to actually give you an active consent. So you might say something like, by clicking enter and proceeding with the study, you have agreed to the informed consent that you just read here. That would be a passive consent. Whereas if they actually had the paper and signed it, that would be active consent. Okay. And here's a funny on the consent process. I think I have one more for you here. Yes. So what I hear you saying is you'll pay for me to get cured. I'm in. And that can be sometimes hard to get people to fully read and fully understand your informed consent. But then that does put the onus on the researcher to make that as understandable as possible. And briefness, well, that's not always in our hands, but we try to make it as clear as possible. All right. So deception and debriefing, we talked about that, right? And you can think of debriefing as a post-experimental interview where you're explaining why the deception was necessary, and you also might provide additional resources if necessary. Sometimes people provide a list of counseling centers to contact or those sort of things. Okay. All right. Inducements. Inducements is a fun one. So what do we give people to participate in our study? Do we give them $1? Do we give them $100? $1 for a student would probably be okay. $100 for a student might not be okay. Why? Because that's too big of an inducement, right? They can't turn that down. That's how they might feel. Okay. And you have to be particularly careful with inducements with vulnerable populations like people in prison. We have to be careful about coercion and freedom to decline participation, right? We want people to always feel free that they can decline. That's partly why we always make sure we give them the benefits of the study, even if they decide not to participate. I was working on a different sort of study last semester. I had someone, and it wasn't that this individual was feeling badly about participating. They were just having some technical problems. And of course, we still gave the participant credit, their experimental credit that they need for their class, and sent them on their way. So they always have to feel free to be able to decline participation without any loss of benefit. And again, this is a little bit more on confidentiality, anonymity, and privacy. Okay. So again, we want to control others' access to information about participants. We will keep participants' identity unknown for anonymity, and won't reveal or connect participants to the information obtained for confidentiality. Okay, so let's talk about animals in research a little bit. That's always a sticky topic. There is a difference between animal welfare versus animal rights. Animal welfare has to do with improving lab conditions and reducing the number of animals that you use based on power analysis, based on those sort of things. Whereas animal rights is the belief that non-human animals have similar rights to humans and perhaps shouldn't be used in research. APA guidelines deals with animal welfare. They don't deal with animal rights. Okay. Also, I'll tell you, you probably already know, but I'll tell you that IRBs only deal with humans. When it's non-humans, it's a different group that you send your review of ethics to. Okay. And I want to say it's IACUC, I believe, is the name. Okay. Now let's talk about writing and reporting of results, publication, and presentation. This brings us to a lot of issues about, being honest about your results. It can be tough. It can be tough because sometimes there's pressure to publish, right? Publish or perish in certain Research One type universities. There's that attitude there. And we know that when you don't find what you're looking for, when you find a negative result, cognitive behavioral therapy is not better than the standard of care for treating of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. Those don't get published as much. And there's a lot of talk always out there that these results should be published more. Negative results are just as important, but yet they don't seem to get published as much. So honesty is critical. Authorship issues. That's a good one to talk about too. What journals have tried to do because there used to be authorship issues where junior authors, even if they were the ones who maybe did a good portion of the work or those sort of things, didn't get the authorship credit that they might deserve. And in psychology, authorship, it's not only important to get authorship, but the order of authorship matters. So first author is usually the primary person on an article. And so there's a difference between first authorship and fourth authorship. Now, other fields don't have this. For example, mathematics. Maybe it'll change someday, but right now, mathematics doesn't have that issue. So people often order those alphabetically. But we do have that issue. So for years, it was a problem because, persons who actually had a lab and had different projects going off the lab would, of course, the lab owner or the lab person in charge of the lab would often want first authorship. And there was some debate about whether that makes sense or not. Well, then they created something called a senior author. And what it means is that an author who is already post tenure and owns the lab and might be the guiding person for the lab, but maybe didn't have the impetus for a particular study, would take the last authorship position and be considered the senior author. So the last authorship position, if you are someone in that position, can be very valuable. And what it allowed is now some of the younger or up and coming authors to take a first authorship position. So that's just kind of an interesting thing in the field that happened some years back. Plagiarism. Okay, so you know what plagiarism is. It happens way more than it should. I was taking my own ethics class back as a postdoc, and my ethics professor was telling us a story that one day one of her students came up to her and said, I came across your article, and it's your article entirely, except it doesn't have your name on it. So someone had literally taken her entire article from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, copied it, and published it under their own name. I mean, that just blew me away. And by the way, don't do that, and definitely don't do that to someone who is the head of the ethics department at a particular university. Bad idea. So that person did not have a happy ending. The professor was fine, but the person who did the plagiarism did not have a happy ending. So anyhow, plagiarism, I mean, I say that as if it's a trivial topic, and like someone, it's always occurs when someone copies a whole article. Of course, it's a complicated topic, and there are a lot of nuances. For example, you probably already have heard about this, but you have to cite yourself. Let's say you conduct 2 or 3 studies that all use the same methods, and each time you're improving upon, let's say, or doing it in a different population, right? If you're going to repeat those methods, you have to cite yourself. You have to cite yourself in the other article. So, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of complexities there. Okay. So ethical dilemmas, well, as we've been talking about, we're always trying to decide if the benefit of the research is greater than the cost of participants. And we always put an emphasis on the participant, on the welfare of the participant. Okay, so we present our research to the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, for the review of the cost-benefit ratio. We talked about that this exists at all institutions that receive federal funding, and that the IRB is only for human participants. Okay. The IRB does have 5 members, and I already shared with you that 1 member must be from outside the institution. This applies to all research conducted by students, faculty, and staff. Thankfully for your project in here, you're not actually working with any participants. I'm giving you some mock data, so you're clear there. Okay. Okay, and then the types of research that you have to decide on a category when you submit your research to the IRB. Is it exempt, where there's no risk of harm? And I say there's no review needed, but nowadays for exempt research, more and more they're doing a review anyway. Minimal risk research. Risk of harm is no greater than risk encountered in daily life or routine physical or psychological tests. And it's a routine review conducted by the IRB. Greater than minimal risk research, thorough review conducted by the IRB. Okay. So meta-analysis. I would think there probably wouldn't have to be even an IRB there, because if you're not using any participants, right? But it could be that it still has to go through the exempt research category. I did a study some years back that involved just using publicly available data. And if you're not familiar with publicly available data, it's when other researchers have actually conducted a study and they don't need they looked at certain things using their data, but they're not going to look at every little thing. They collected a whole bunch of data. They're not going to use it all. So they might make it publicly available to others so it doesn't go to waste. So I had access to this publicly available data that I was going to use to conduct some research, learning about stigma in mental health services, in seeking out mental health services. And I didn't know who the participants were, right? How could I? It was publicly available research, but I still had to submit it for a review by the IRB for some exempt research. Okay. So, so that's an example of that. Minimal risk, maybe you're giving some psychological measures about personality and general life stress levels. Okay, something like that. And then greater than minimal risk research is probably something where anytime I think you're using blood, it's greater than minimal risk research. But also probably if you were looking at like previous traumatic events, abuse, anything like that, I would say definitely would fall under greater than minimal risk research. What's the IRB's impact on research? Well, sometimes we have an extended time for approval of study. Submissions often need to be revised or clarified, and they can be very cautious around approval. So I was sharing before, right, about sometimes IRBs tend to be very cautious around asking people about suicidality, fearful that it might actually cause people to become suicidal, and that does not seem to be the case, at least in most circumstances that we might consider. So we have to just, show the research and be informative if we're looking to study something that's considered to be a little more risky. Okay. Okay. Actually, just the treadmill was in my protocol. The rest of it was the IRB's idea. So I'm poking a little bit of fun here at the IRB, putting the helmet and the knee pads and all this stuff on the treadmill. Okay, but I'll be fair. I'll poke fun at the other side now. Oops, sorry. Well, now, okay, try this. Okay, the IRB pressure cooker. So this is now showing the life of the in the hands of the IRB, where they're trying to deal with laws, regulations, ethics, and researchers want to get their studies out, and it can be a hard thing for them too. And money, of course, being an issue, right? Okay, so anyhow. Okay. So the FDA's approach to approving new drugs is a go slow mentality. Typically, I think we had a bit more of a go fast mentality with the COVID vaccine, but typically we do phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies. So phase 1 is a research study designed to test a new drug or treatment in a small group of people for the first time to evaluate its safety, determine a safe dosage range, and identify potential side effects. Phase 2 is a research study designed to test a drug or treatment in a larger group of people than in phase 1 to see if it's effective and to further evaluate its safety. And then phase 3 is a research study designed to test a drug or treatment that is given to large groups of people using highly controlled research designs in order to confirm the intervention's effectiveness, monitor side effects, compare it to commonly used treatments, and collect information that will allow the drug or treatment to be used safely. So each time you're building upon how many participants will get the drug and your evaluation of it. Okay. Okay, so here's a little bit more about the care of animals used in research, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, IACUC. So the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee considers the benefits of animal research, along with trying to take care of animal welfare. So they insist that labs are inspected every 6 months. Animals must have proper housing, food, healthcare, and clean conditions. Okay. So remember, groups like this, like IACUC, will deal with animal welfare, not animal rights. So let's look at this little case study here. Animals and humans have the propensity to react passively to aversive stimuli, even when a chance to avoid the negative experience exists. This is known as learned helplessness. To study the response in dogs, researchers adapted a procedure from previous research where dogs were placed in harnesses and subjected to inescapable intense shocks that were just short of the level that produces convulsions or muscular spasms. Researchers strapped dogs approximately the size of an average beagle into a harness that restricted their head and leg movement. Next, dogs were given a shock via electrodes taped to the foot pads of their hind feet. The researchers assigned dogs to 1 of 4 conditions, 3 of which involved inescapable shock. Later, when dogs encountered shocks in a situation where escape was possible, those that previously experienced inescapable shock were less likely to attempt escape. Subsequent experiments incorporated conditions that tested dogs under the influence of curare, a compound often considered a poison which blocks neuromuscular activity. These dogs were essentially temporarily paralyzed and subjected to shocks in an effort to better understand why dogs exhibit learned helplessness. Based on his findings, Seligman developed a richer understanding about some of the causes of depression in humans, and these findings have led to new therapies. Yeah, kind of tough when you hear it about dogs, isn't it? It's a really complex issue. And I have my biases about it. I'm sure most people do. And, it can produce really, really valuable results, but is it the right thing to do? It's certainly a big, complex, and debatable issue. Okay. We talked a little bit about fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Again, making up the data or results and reporting them is fabrication. Falsification is manipulating the research materials, the equipment, the processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. Okay. And plagiarism, of course, we talked about. So the second one can be a bit tricky. And the way to avoid removing participants who maybe don't go along with your theory for all the good reasons in the world is to make your decisions beforehand. So in other words, you might decide, I'm going to remove everyone from my study who does not have complete data. And you decide that before you run your study. That would be a great way to avoid falsification. Because if you do it later, you say, well, I don't know if I want to remove everyone who doesn't have full data. And then you find out if you test everyone with full data, you get a different result than if you test everyone who just has partial data. And then it gets awfully tempting to report the one that benefits your research. So that's just a word on that. Okay. And research misconduct does not include honest error or differences of opinion, of course. Okay. Plagiarism we talked about. Piecemeal and duplicate publication is an interesting piece. Again, I talked to you about the publish or perish mentality that's sometimes out there. And another thing that can be really tempting is to either publish your results in more than one place, or to cut it up into really, really small pieces and just publish little bits of it at a time. And sometimes, I mean, I'm not going to say studies can't result in multiple publications. I certainly think they can. You just have to be, kind of thoughtful and fair about what's really a publication that stands on its own. Okay. A conflict of interest exists in research when a researcher's primary interest in the integrity of a study is compromised by a secondary interest, such as personal gain, like financial profit. And we talked about this in pharmaceutical studies, for example, right? Pharmaceutical companies sometimes really want to just hear that their drug works well. They don't want to, they may not be as open to hearing other things. And they often pay their researchers. So that's a conflict of interest right there. And I'm not saying honest research can't or isn't done by pharmaceutical industry. I'm just saying there is an issue there that has to be addressed. Okay, so we already talked about authorship credit and that whole notion about about how it's set up. And I shared with you how many research journals have now adopted guidelines to help authorship groups determine credit. You will see that if you go to publish a journal article these days. It's supposed to be based on the quality and quantity of one's contributions to a study, and they have become very strict about telling you who or who should not get authorship when you submit an article. Okay. So scientific integrity. Maintaining an open and honest approach to science while adhering to ethical principles throughout the research process. This includes researching important topics that may be socially or politically unpopular. The ethical treatment of data. Oh, this one's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah, this is from this guy. I failed as a scientist. I adapted research data and fabricated research, not once, but several times, not for a short period, but over a long period of time. This is a famous researcher who did all of this, basically. And a lot of his research, unfortunately, hit the media. And because it was so interesting and new and controversial, and no one had found this before, and no one had found it before because look what he was doing. So yeah. Okay. We talked about falsification, fabrication, massaging the data can be like dropping participants, reporting only significant results, including some variables, but not others. Again, a lot of this, and I think the dropping of participants might be falsification too, but either case, making your decisions a priori helps a lot. Okay. Decide rules ahead of time, collect enough data, list all the variables, report all the conditions, share the what if analyses. Share the what if analyses. So, I mean, we talked about some of this last semester, like, what if we have someone and we're not sure if they are an outlier or not? Well, let's report it both ways. Okay. Clearly state covariates, right? What am I covarying out here? Okay. And data processing center. So, if you torture the data long enough, you'll get a significant result. You heard of that one? Okay. So this is like P equals 0.057, and this is P equals 0.042. Okay. Misrepresenting data through words. You can overstate the data, right? You can overstate some mild correlation and try and make it into a theory that supposedly explains a whole area of study. You can also do it with scale with charts. If you look at these two, right? So if you show it like you would show it on the right, there'd be essentially no difference between the memory booster and no booster. There should be a line over here that actually goes up pretty much to the same level as memory booster, a bar, right? So this should be equal on the right. On the left, what they're doing is, oh, look, you get a score of 8.67 here and a score of 8.82 here. What a difference, but it's really not a meaningful difference if you have a scale that goes from like 1 to 10. Okay. And then we have the file drawer problem. I don't know if you've heard of this one, but this is when what we talked about, where a lot of significant, non-significant findings don't get published. Maybe you don't try and pursue anything that doesn't fit your theory. Like I said, there's a bias towards publishing results that support the hypothesis. So in the supply closet, we see all these non-significant or non-supportive findings. It's been 8 long years, but we're going to see if they can be revived by releasing them back into their natural habitat. Okay. If you'd like to learn more about plagiarism, feel free to check out this example. We talked about self-plagiarism a little bit. Also paraphrasing, where you summarize other ideas and your own ideas without providing a proper citation. So all things to be careful of. I always like to say sensitive topics aren't off limits. Think creatively. Think smaller sometimes. Use sound research design. And I'll give you one example of cheating and stealing. So I had a student a few years back who wanted to do he was taking a research methods course with me, and he wanted to do something about cheating and stealing, people's attitudes about cheating and stealing. So the issue was we can't really ask participants, especially in a student study like that, have you ever cheated? That would be not okay. Because that could put them at risk for all kinds of academic issues if their name or anything came to light. So we couldn't do that. So instead, we came up with this clever research design where instead of asking the participant, have you ever cheated? We just asked them, and we didn't even really want to ask them about their attitudes towards cheating, you know. So instead, we came up with this way of saying, well, someone else cheated. Someone else cheated. What do you think the general attitudes towards this would be? And it was a way of sort of getting around that issue. Okay. Pain can be tricky, alcohol consumption in minors, bullying, social isolation, all can be tricky things to look at, but I would encourage anyone who's interested in looking at these to just think through what might be a clever way to ask the question. Bullying, you might not want to ask people if they ever acted as a bully, but you could give a scenario of someone who was acting as a bully and see their reaction to it. Okay. So I'm going to give you a few different discuss and debates that we can talk about a little bit more in class. So let's look at these. First, let's consider the FDA's process to approving new pharmaceutical drugs. Do you agree with the three-phase approach? What are some strengths and weaknesses of the process? And let's add to this, how do you feel about the development of the COVID vaccine, or vaccines, I should say? Did they follow this three-phase approach in your opinion? Do you think, anything you might have about that? Or we can just talk about this in general, but that's the idea. Okay. Number 2, suppose you are the co-author of an academic paper that's being prepared for publication. The original research idea is yours, but you let your co-authors handle the data collection and actual writing of the report. Who should claim lead authorship in this scenario? Okay, and here's the third one. During the mid-1960s, Lord Humphreys, the doctoral student in sociology, was interested in learning about men who led ostensibly heterosexual lives, but also engaged in impersonal homosexual acts in public restrooms. To gain access to this population, Humphreys acted as a participant observer by assuming the role of a voyeur lookout or watch queen for other men who were engaged in these sexual acts. Humphreys eventually garnered the trust of some of these men who were willing to be interviewed for his study. However, Humphreys was concerned that only using the men who voluntarily provided information would not give him a complete understanding of the motivations of these individuals. Humphreys thus recorded the license plate numbers of other individuals he observed. He then obtained the men's home addresses by misrepresenting himself as a market researcher to the Department of Motor Vehicles. A year later, Humphreys visited the homes of these men, posing as a public health researcher. The information he obtained from these unknown individuals helped to refute negative stereotypes about these deviant individuals. Okay. So 3 different things we can talk about when we meet next. I'm going to talk to you about one more thing in just a moment. Okay, so the last thing I just wanted to talk to you about was that one thing I said we can talk more about in class, but it was that stutterer study, also called the monster study. It was a speech impediment experiment that was done on the children that lived in an orphanage. And it was conducted to find out if stuttering was inherited or did environment play a key factor. And Wendell Johnson was the speech pathologist that conducted the study to find the cause and cure for stuttering. It violated a lot of ethical issues because the children were put in a place of psychological harm. There was no informed consent given, and the subjects were deceived. Also, the researcher had a biased opinion in the study because he was a stutterer himself and was desperate for a cure. So that's that one study I didn't have information for you about before. So I just wanted to give that to you right now, just so you had it, and you had the full package for ethical issues that we were going to discuss in this course. So with that said, that's the end of lecture 2. Stay safe, be well. Looking forward to talking to you later.